Bible smack. All right. Today I just want to go through a little philosophical argument that I'm dealing out. I'm having it as part of my book, but what is the truth? It is so far only an internet book that basically it's my blog, and you just go to www.biblesmack.blogspot.com and head over to October, if not November, I think it's October of 2018. And it'll say, but what is the truth? And then it'll give you links to each chapter and stuff like that. But basically, we try to figure out how to engage in worldview issues, and how do you start off, with a intellectual foundation. Okay, how is your starting point? Some people have gone to deal with science, and some people have gone into the area of philosophy. But one area I don't see a lot of people going into is the area of history. Now, history really is like the reality of the past. What happened? And you look at it empirically, okay? Say, well, I know so-and-so said this, so-and-so said that. Now, on a personal level, we have a very limited history, but we have our own recording of history and our own personal experience. So it still is an experience. Now, I remember as a boy, my grandmother, I call her my meemaw, she was a nurse when I was a little boy, and she was a nurse at a retirement village. And I remember going there and meeting a woman who was like 106. Okay. So that was around 85. So you're thinking, all right, 15, 21 years behind 1900. That would be, what would that be? 1879. Okay. So in my personal experience, I can only trace back history to 1879 from experiences. Okay. And then everything past that, now it's 2019 when I'm doing this, so it's well over 30 years later. But basically, you don't get very much human experience beyond that point anyway. I mean, there might be some people who are older than me who might have encountered somebody older, but, basically, personal experience only goes so far. But that is what we can personally encounter in reality. And so after that, then we go back in history. And then we go back in progression and see what happened. But history is recorded empirically. Now, the evolution debate is something that is not based off history, but we'll go over that in a little bit later. So I want to kind of hit a couple things of a historical argument for God. First of all, we have personal experience. So I have personally experienced the gospel, not only being introduced to church from the time I was a little boy, and I was recalling a memory earlier that's kind of funny, and they were like, everybody would go in Sunday school and we'd pray, and I'd look around and everybody's kind of got their hands folded and their heads down. And so I remember when I would do that, and people would say they're talking to Jesus, I'd look in and I would look in and I think, okay, Jesus is inside my hands. Yeah. But basically, you would experience the people worshiping God, and they tell you about God, the right and wrong, and then you would kind of accumulate that to your worldview, okay? And so I'm thinking maybe I'm 3 years old, and my first mental memories and exposure to the church start there. And then then I had a love for science. And I remember my parents giving me a children's encyclopedia when I was the age of 6 years old. And my mother was a school teacher, and so I really got into science. And so I was exposed to evolution just 3 years later. And I remember looking at the pictures and different animals that were prehistoric and stuff. And especially this one, it looked like a Komodo dragon, but it had like a giant sail on it. And, it had the spikes up and stuff. And I'm not going to act scholarly. I forgot the name of the dinosaur off the top of my head. But, of course, you see the classic stuff, like the Triceratops versus the Tyrannosaurus Rex and all that kind of stuff. But, nevertheless, I'm exposed to that worldview starting at the age of 6. And, of course, going through the public school system. And then we would deal with things on TV and movies and media and stuff like that as well. So I'm, really exposed to that at that age. And I remember first seeing things on like Nickelodeon and stuff, and they'd have like a little kids program, and they'd introduce concepts of atheism. Okay, and there's like, well, there's no such thing as miracles. And they'd pound this out. There's no such thing as miracles. So I'm dealing with this naturalistic worldview that early on, and I'm also dealing with Christian worldview as well. And I'm not really getting everything together, but I have to deal with life. Okay, so I have an existential experience of life, and life starts throwing hardships at me. And I remember getting abused and picked on, going to school and stuff like that, and basically, bullied, jumped, cursed out, spat upon, all sorts of things. And it was just like an ongoing, nasty kind of ghetto thing. Okay, and basically, as I'm dealing out that, I'm seeing the alternatives, okay? And so, like, as I'm dealing with these things, I had bullies, and the ideas of suicide are starting to come up in my head. Because it's like, what is the point of living in the natural world? If you're not going to have a good life, why live at all? Okay? If death is only just pushing delete, then, maybe, in a bad time, maybe I ought to delete, So I'm dealing with that. And then, also God and stuff. And like, well, God can do good things. God's got heaven, and so I'm dealing out my experiences. I'm trying to say, like, okay, maybe God can help me. And I remember dealing with some issues and going to Bible camp. And I went to Bible camp, and I hit this issue with like these kids, and they're doing stuff. And I'm sure that, some of it's probably like, I got attention deficit disorder and stuff like that. So there may be processes in my mind that make me awkward. And there are also issues of other people who are predators, who see, okay, this is a kid with weaknesses, so we can bully them, okay? They can take out their issues and their aggression on me. I was an easy target, okay? Now, thankfully, I am a very thick, very tough physical specimen, and so I can take a lot of abuse. These days I watch YouTube videos, and you see these little kids, and they're like, somebody just comes up, oh, and I'm like, wow, like one shot and you really get knocked out. I mean, I'll take a licking and keep on ticking. Now I'll probably snap your neck after a while. I ain't going down with that. But basically, God had given me a body that could take a physical toll, and so good for me. But basically, then also I ended up learning how to fight and how to defend myself, and then really getting into sports. And I still love combat sports. All right, I really want to do them right now. I just need a partner. Okay, I I could probably be a professional instructor if I got facilities and stuff together. But nevertheless, so how do I cope with my going through life? I meet kids, and I see people are, the answer to life's problems to get by is do drugs. Okay, do drugs and do all the fun things, and that'll get you by. And I got to survive the tough times and started to go to church. I had been out of church for many years. My parents just weren't into it at that point in their life, and they got back into church. But basically, at that time, they weren't going to church, and so when that happens, um, I had already decided to be a Christian and have morals and stuff, and so turned to God and I was like, I can't do drugs. Drugs are bad. Okay. I had been educated. Well, one good thing in public school was they had a program called DARE, Drug Abuse Resistance Education. And so they talked about how, like, if you do drugs, you'll get addicted to drugs, and it'll cause all these diseases, or you could end up dying instantly, or you could get yourself in crime and trouble and things that were very bad, and, basically don't do drugs. I saw somebody making a complaint, it's like, well, I was telling them that we were dealing with crack, don't do drugs, see how that worked. I was like, well, it did work when you did it. When you didn't do drugs, then stuff wouldn't happen. Okay. So basically, I was able to avoid that kind of stuff, but I had friends who kind of got into it. And now, those people are gone. And when I see them, they're like messed up. Okay. And basically, that's the fruit of that kind of lifestyle. All right. So, going back to it, and then also dealing with success. Okay. It's like you either succeed or life's not worth living, and survival of the fittest. And you got to be the best, or else. And I had to struggle with that in high school. And my achievements and stuff, I had done a lot of good things, and I achieved a lot of good things, but I didn't achieve the ultimate package or the ultimate prize. And, I'm still thinking, like, I got the rest of my life to live. What am I supposed to be like, okay, I never was, or I has been, or, life's supposed to end now, But as I pursued God, I found peace, I found tranquility, and, God forgives me. And if things go bad or things go worse, I still got a God who forgives me. And so, with my experience, I come to this point, this decision, to follow out Christianity. Now, everybody's got different experiences. Okay, I'm not saying that's the truth. I'm saying finding truth and walking towards it. Okay, so experience, we got to look at the whole. Okay, yes, there's a lot of good, there's a lot of bad. So what do we see when it comes to all the world? The majority of the world religions are what we call monotheistic. That means that they believe that there is a creator God, that it's the one creator God that ultimately created everything. In fact, most of them are historically what we call Abrahamic. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And there are some subsets of monotheism as well. We'll talk about this in a minute, but the Greeks eventually developed an idea of monotheism. And then there are, the Egyptians briefly had a big roar of monotheism with the god Ra. But basically, then you had like Islam and other groups, Sikhism. Okay, the Sikhs are monotheistic. So now you have a huge world tradition on monotheism, but also the majority of religions have a messianic figure. They have an ultimate hero to save the day, to overcome evil. There is developed a messianic idea, the world leader, the world hero. And so you see messiahs in pagan religions. as well as the monotheistic religion. Of course, the main Messiah, and he's a Messiah. Even in Hinduism, Jesus is a God. Okay, but yeah, Jesus is the ultimate figure of all who's mentioned as a messianic figure or as a hero, even in non-Christianity when you deal them all out. So basically, monotheism and Jesus is historically the way to go. And then once you start going down that route, you also notice how people find peace in this. And you have many people who overcome things like drug addiction or poverty or oppression. Even like in India, the figure of Christ was used by Gandhi as a teacher to proclaim peace to the nations and ultimately won the independence of India. Okay? So, Jesus is a part of that cultural conversation even to this day. And the same methods that Gandhi used that were based off the teachings of Christ are then re-put back into Christianity through Martin Luther King. So, once again, we have that perennial figure of Jesus Christ. Now, this is, giving me motivation to look into history at the Judeo-Christian history, okay? But also in the ancient history, we find some themes, okay? We find a monotheism. The most ancient histories, all right, when you go as far back as possible into the histories, you find monotheistic figures. You find them in Egypt, India, and China. Now, I'm going off the top of my head, but I've got those all recorded in my book, but off the top of my head, China had a god named Shangdi, and he was the monotheistic god. They would sacrifice a bull to him every year. Well, in Genesis, there are sacrifices unto the god El Shaddai. Shangdi, Shaddai. See how similar they are? So basically, you see those things. And you also have other similarities. You don't find consistent history. And Usher said this, that before Herodotus, you don't find a true lineal sense of history. Even when they talk about the history of Egypt, they don't know if the pharaohs are really a lineal line as much as different families and different territories, and then just lined up territories. So in other words, you got 3, maybe even a dozen pharaohs at the same time, okay, ruling each territory, and then they're all mentioned in a row, and so you just assumed it's a lineal history, when actually it was a short period of history. So basically, the Bible is the most complete history. And of course, the Bible's history goes from 404 BC about to 95 AD. Okay, so you've got about 4,000 years of history, mostly condensed to about, let's say, 2,600 years condensed to about that much. And you got a specific history going back and forth. Okay, but basically all that stuff adds together, and then all these ancient histories agree to things like a worldwide flood. They agree to man having advanced ages from before that flood. So lots of these coincidences kind of interact when you start to put all the stuff together. Now, also, one thing, not only is it that it's got the largest history, but that the competitor was the history of those who were into mythology. These were polytheists who had magical explanations for all things. Now, their system of thought would be debunked by people in their own tradition. The ancient philosophers worked on this and debunked mythology. These are what we call the pre-Socratic philosophers, the philosophers who lived before the philosopher Socrates. And they were trying to figure out how the natural world works, how time works, how to understand truth. And many of them did experiment with things like materialistic atheism. But essentially what happened was they debunked mythology. And even though they debunked mythology, they could not prop up history from an atheistic, materialistic standpoint. You know, they would try to say, well, the whole world is one substance. Then they were like, well, the whole world is 2, 4, 5. And then they finally figured out, you know, we can't really say what it is because we don't know what it is. This was a fallacy of inductive logic. And eventually they came to a point of what they call Zeno's paradox. And I'm going to give a version of it that's not quite where it's going because I'm applying it to a different topic. But essentially what it is that you can never exceed what you've observed. And they would do this with a story they call the tortoise and Achilles. Later on, Aesop takes that and then redoes the story to call it the tortoise and the hare. But the tortoise and the Achilles, what happens is that Achilles is faster than the tortoise, and the tortoise made a wager with him. He says, you give me this much advance in the race, and then I'll race you. He's like, well, I'm faster, so it'll be okay. But what happens is that every time the Achilles steps up, the tortoise has already exceeded and stepped up farther. And so as he starts stepping up, what happens is that Achilles gets stuck behind him. And he's always in line with the tortoise, so he never exceeds him. Kind of like if you're driving down the road, you can't go faster than the car that's in front of you. So we cannot exceed our observations. And so this was a problem. They can't know what they don't know. And so eventually, you have Socrates and Plato come on the scene, and then they start getting into the idea of God. So basically, polytheism surrenders to monotheism, and atheism was in an experimental phase, but never really got a foot in the race. So now you have all history, which is relatively short, and it's all going into the Judeo-Christian point of view. Well, so the question is, all right, so now we have the Bible history, but is the Bible history historical? Well, when you look at the book of Genesis, what you have is you have some different accounts. And they would call this in the Hebrew Toldoth. And if you look at the King James Bible, or many of the translations, it'll say generations. And Genesis breaks down into about 9 of these. So each generation is a different account prior to Moses, probably written down on a tablet. Okay? And then the tablets would be gathered, and then one day, Moses would take the tablets and put them out on the scrolls. Okay? And under inspiration, he might edit them a little bit, but generally, that's what he had. Now, many different theories from naturalists have been put forth against this history in order to debunk it. And the most popular was the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP theory. Now, as I said, I've already got this written down, but I'm going off of memory. So, the idea is that this was just a made-up construction. Well, they decided that, okay, well, if it mentions Jehovah, then that's a totally different source of history. So in other words, here's the Jehovah scholars writing their stories down. Then there's the Elohim historians that are writing their stuff down. And then, so here's the priestly source, and here's the Deuteronomy source. But what happens is, as they're starting to go over this, and you look at the text itself, you got Elohim, Jehovah, all kind of blending into each other. And so it's not following the strict pattern. And they don't have any manuscripts that are divided up in JEDP. So what you have is you have one document. This is clearly one document that was made to be one document, and it's not trying to be several documents pasted onto each other. Then you also have the issue of like, well, is this historical? And most of the secular scholars are, to a T, in the ancient history, they always thought this is exactly what it's saying. It was intended to say this. They didn't believe it. They thought it was a myth. They thought it was spaced together. But they knew that this is what the intent was. And, I had a professor once tell me that he believed he was a theistic evolutionist. He'd say he believed that Genesis 1 was a legend. And I said, okay, but how long are the days? He's like, well, it was seven literal days creation, or 7 literal days in the week, 6 days of creation. It's like, yeah, it was intended to be literal. It's like, but you don't believe it was Christian? Yeah. So, they didn't, have an agenda to warp the interpretation because they just denied the whole thing outright. So since they took that path, then this new path of trying to blend the Bible into these other traditions is something that's synthetic. It's new. Okay? So the new guys come in, they've got an agenda that they're trying to, reinterpret the Bible. But the Bible says what it says. It was meant to be a historical narrative. Once again, because I'm going off from memory, I forget, but when you're looking through Genesis 1, for instance, it says, and this was the third day, and this one, and evening, and morning, and. Well, it's something consecutive. Memory is starting to pop up again. But the wall consecutive, I think, or the vav consecutive. Basically, these were indicators that this was a historical narrative. And even Jesus, Jesus as a source, not simply like, oh, if you believe he's the Messiah, but Jesus as a rabbi, who was obviously recognized as a rabbi at that time, blended the two together in his teachings in Mark chapter 10 about men and women. He quotes a verse out of Genesis 1, then he quotes a verse out of Genesis 2. Obviously, the two passages were right there together because he quoted them right there together. So, all right, the Bible is meant to be a literal history. The Bible is the history, and that's the history that we have. And then we can go forward from there and we look at things like Bible prophecy. You think about, for instance, Abraham. Okay, now Moses, yes, he's writing 500 years down, from Abraham. And he's talking about these records. So if you still want to doubt the historicity, you say, okay, well, Moses is writing that 500 years down. But then you also have to remember that the Jews and the Arabs have become a great people over the period of thousands and thousands of years, and they've not been wiped out, even though there's been many attempts, especially upon the Jews. So what you end up with is you have the Bible when it's talking about, yours will be as the sands of the sea, or the stars of the sky. Those things are down there. When there is a tension brought up between the seed of Isaac and the seed of Jacob. How do you predict that your enemy is going to be your enemy in centuries later? Because you got to make the other guy angry at you. How do you get that going? So, how is it that, like, Palestine is throwing rocket launchers at Israel every couple days, okay? When, 4,000 years ago that was said. All right, how's what you're saying keep that going? Okay. So basically, you have all these different prophecies, the preservation of the scriptures. We're finding more ancient and more. We've got more documents about the Bible than any other book in existence. Okay, both in the ancient past and today. Okay, how does that happen? When we got more Bibles than we have believers, I think. I could be wrong about that, but we're about there. So this is just an ongoing thing, and then all the different. There's been somewhere between 300 and 400 messianic prophecies, and most of the people who believe in any of these prophecies are the Christians. Okay, or most of them who believe that the Bible has prophecies are also Christians. Okay, so the Jews didn't think they fulfilled without a Messiah, but yet the Christians see the Messiah. They see Jesus in the Old Testament. I do, and I've argued in other places that. Well, you have those themes ongoing. You have a church that went and dominated the world. I mean, all these things keep on going, and they fulfill that fact that this is history. And so then you go back and you find the God of history. So once you understand this is where we come from, this is the history, then you don't have to look at these other explanations. And you can know that this is here because God made it. Catch you later.